The crystal chandeliers of Blackwood Manor dripped light like frozen waterfalls, scattering rainbows across the polished marble floors. Each prism of light seemed to mock Eleanor Vance, reflecting her plain black and white uniform 1,000 times over. She moved through the throng of jewel-draped women and tuxedoed men with practiced invisibility. A ghost whose only purpose was to balance a tray of champagne flutes. This was the Blackwoods' 50th wedding anniversary, an event designed not to celebrate love but to broadcast power. And Eleanor, for tonight, was just another part of the hired scenery. She kept her eyes downcast, her expression a perfect mask of pleasant neutrality. But behind the mask, she was a cartographer of memory, charting every detail of the house she knew better than its current occupants. She knew the subtle warp in the oak floorboard near the grand fireplace, a flaw her father had called a wabi-sabi smile. She knew the way the moonlight at this exact time of year would strike the stained glass window on the landing, casting a seraph's wing across the gallery wall. Her father, Robert Vance, had not just designed this house, he had breathed a soul into its bones. A soul Alistair Blackwood had stolen, along with everything else. "You, girl." The voice was sharp, a shard of glass in the velvet murmur of the party. Eleanor stopped, turning slowly. Julian Blackwood, the heir to the stolen empire, stood before her, his face flushed with champagne and entitlement. His silk tie was askew, a smirk playing on his lips that he probably thought was charming. It was merely cruel. "Another," he said, gesturing with an empty glass. "Of course, sir," Eleanor replied, her voice even and low. She reached for a fresh flute from her tray. As she offered it, Julian's foot shot out, hooking her ankle with a casual, deliberate malice. The world tilted. For a heart-stopping second, she fought for balance, the tray wobbling precariously. But gravity was inexorable. The silver tray crashed to the floor with a sound that ripped through the party's genteel hum. Glass shattered, and a frothing wave of golden champagne soaked into the priceless Aubusson rug. Silence descended. Every eye in the grand ballroom turned to her, the clumsy waitress, the disruption in their perfect evening. Julian laughed, a short, barking sound. "Butterfingers," he drawled. "Father, you really must get better help. This one seems to be broken." Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks, a burning tide of shame and fury, but she held it back, locking it down behind her carefully constructed walls. She knelt, beginning to pick up the larger shards of glass, her movements precise, refusing to show them how her hands trembled. Then a shadow fell over her. Cynthia Blackwood, matriarch of the clan, loomed above, her face a mask of glacial disdain. Diamonds glittered at her throat, cold as her eyes. She held a glass of deep blood-red wine. "Look at this mess," Cynthia hissed, her voice low enough that only those nearby could hear, yet loud enough to feel like a physical blow. "You have ruined a rug that is worth more than your entire miserable life. You are a clumsy, incompetent little nothing." Eleanor did not look up. She continued to gather the broken glass, placing it carefully onto the dented tray. "My apologies, madam. It was an accident." "An accident?" Cynthia's laugh was brittle. "Incompetence is not an accident. It is a character flaw. Perhaps a more permanent reminder of your failure is in order." Before Eleanor could react, Cynthia tilted her wrist. The rich red wine cascaded down, splashing over Eleanor's hair and soaking the front of her crisp white shirt. It spread like a fresh wound, a vibrant, ugly stain against the stark white. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, some shocked, most merely entertained by the little drama. The wine was cold against her skin, but it was the burning humiliation that made her flinch. Julian snickered beside his mother. "A splash of colour, mother. It almost improves the drab uniform." Eleanor froze, her hand hovering over a piece of broken flute. For a single terrifying moment, she imagined closing her fist around the shard, feeling its edge bite into her palm. She could rise, and she could— What? What could a waitress do? Slowly she looked up, her gaze meeting Cynthia's, and in that moment the mask of the deferential servant slipped. Cynthia Blackwood, for the first time, saw the woman beneath the uniform. She saw eyes that were not cowed, but were instead ancient and cold, and filled with a terrifying, calculating calm. It was the look of a predator that had been waiting, patiently, for a very long time. Cynthia's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She had expected tears, apologies, groveling. She had not expected this silent, profound defiance. "Get out," Cynthia snapped, recovering her composure. "Go to the kitchens and tell the manager you are fired. I don't want to see your face again." Eleanor rose to her feet with a fluid grace that seemed out of place for a disgraced servant. She didn't wipe at the wine stain, letting it sit on her chest like a medal of dishonor she would transmute into a declaration of war. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "As you wish, Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. She turned and walked away, the eyes of the entire party following her. They saw a waitress, fired for her clumsiness. They saw a stain of red wine on a white shirt. They did not see the end of their world walking away on silent, determined feet. They did not know that the wine hadn't just stained her uniform, it had watered a seed of vengeance that had been dormant for 2 decades, waiting for this exact moment to finally, irrevocably, bloom. The staff entrance slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the cool night air. For a moment, Eleanor leaned against the cold brick, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her hands shaking. The wine on her shirt was beginning to feel sticky. She closed her eyes, and the image of Cynthia's smug, cruel face was seared onto the back of her eyelids. The laughter of the guests, the shattering glass, the cold trickle of the wine, it was a symphony of her humiliation. She had endured so much to get here, years of working thankless jobs, of scraping by, of swallowing her pride until it felt like a stone in her gut. She had served coffee to men who had once been her father's sycophants. She had cleaned the houses of women who had once envied her mother. She had made herself small, invisible, forgettable. All for this. All for the long game. Her plan had been meticulous, a slow-moving glacier of retribution set to carve on its own schedule. She had intended to wait another 6 months for the final financial dominoes to fall into a neat, undeniable row. But the wine was an accelerant. It was the universe telling her that the time for patience was over. The time for subtlety was past. Tonight, the Blackwoods had not just insulted a waitress. They had desecrated the memory of her father in the very house he had built. And for that, there would be no more waiting. She pushed off the wall and walked not towards the employee parking lot, but around the manicured hedge maze towards a small, forgotten service cottage at the edge of the sprawling estate. She had a key. Of course she had a key. Her father had designed the lock. Inside, the small room was sparse, containing only a cot, a small table, and a locked footlocker. She had rented it from the groundskeeper under a false name weeks ago, a small staging ground for the final act. She stripped off the stained uniform, dropping it into a heap on the floor as if shedding a skin. Beneath it, she wore a simple dark slip. From the footlocker, she retrieved her own clothes. A tailored black dress of severe elegance, a pair of understated but expensive heels, and a small leather clutch. As she dressed, her reflection in the dusty window pane transformed. The harried, invisible waitress vanished. In her place stood a woman of formidable poise. Her dark hair, still damp with wine at the front, was pulled back into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. Her face, pale and determined, was set like stone. She looked like she belonged in the grand ballroom, not as a servant, but as a guest of honor, or as the executioner. Her father's face swam in her memory. Robert Vance, a man of gentle genius whose hands could coax poetry from steel and glass. He had loved this house, every line and angle of it. He'd spoken of the way the light would move through the rooms as if he were describing a lover's caress. He had trusted Alistair Blackwood, his friend and partner, with that love. He'd seen him as a brother. And Alistair had rewarded that trust with a serpent's kiss. He had leveraged their shared company into ruin, using complex financial instruments Robert couldn't begin to understand. He'd cooked the books, created fraudulent debts, and then, at the moment of crisis, presented Robert with an ultimatum. Sign over everything, the company, the patents, the intellectual property to all his designs, including the manor itself, or face a public ruin and criminal charges for a fraud he didn't commit. Robert, to protect his family's name, had signed. He'd walked away with nothing but a pittance and a broken spirit. The light had gone out of his eyes. He stopped sketching, stopped dreaming. A year later, a heart attack, which the doctor called a medical event, but Eleanor knew was a casualty of a broken heart, took him from them. Her mother, a ghost in her own life, had followed him 6 months after that, fading away from grief. Eleanor, at 19, was left alone with nothing but a legacy of betrayal and a burning, unquenchable need for justice. She opened the clutch. Inside, alongside a tube of deep red lipstick, was a slim, expensive-looking cigar, a silver lighter, and a single thick document, folded into a neat rectangle. It was a certified copy. The original was safely lodged in a vault with her lawyer. She ran her thumb over the crisp paper, the culmination of a decade of silent, painstaking work. Her anger was no longer a hot, rushing thing. It had cooled, hardened into something far more dangerous. It was the cold, dense weight of an iceberg, with 9/10 of its power hidden beneath the surface. The Blackwoods had only ever seen the tip. Tonight, they would feel the full, crushing weight of its passage. She applied the lipstick with a steady hand, a slash of crimson that was the exact shade of the wine they had poured on her. It was a promise, a war paint. She walked out of the cottage, the gravel crunching under her heels. She did not use the service path. She walked straight up the main drive towards the blazing lights of the house, her house. The party was still going, the music a faint, elegant pulse in the night. They thought they had dismissed her. They thought she was gone. They had no idea she was just about to arrive. Eleanor remembered the day her father first showed her the blueprints for Blackwood Manor. They were spread across the huge oak drafting table that dominated his study, the room smelling of graphite, paper, and Earl Grey tea. She was 12, all knees and elbows, but she was mesmerized by the intricate lines, the delicate cross-hatching, the mathematical precision that somehow promised to become a home. "You see this, Ellie?" he'd said, his voice soft with passion. He tapped a long, sensitive finger on the section detailing the grand staircase. A staircase isn't just for getting from one floor to another, it's the heart of the house. It needs to flow. It needs to feel like it's breathing. He'd called Alistair Blackwood his partner, his friend. Uncle Alistair, she'd been taught to call him. He and Cynthia would come for dinner, bringing expensive gifts and filling their modest home with loud laughter and the scent of expensive perfume. Alistair was all bluff and bluster, a salesman who could charm a bird from a tree, while her father was the quiet genius who gave him something of substance to sell. Robert Vance was the architect. Alistair Blackwood was the brand. "We're going to build a legacy, Robert," Alistair would boom, clapping her father on the back so hard it made him stumble. "The Blackwood Vance name will be synonymous with quality, with vision." But soon the name on the letterhead became just Blackwood Holdings. The partnership became an employment. The friend became a boss. Eleanor was too young to understand the legal papers her father would stare at late into the night. His face etched with a worry she had never seen before. She only understood the slow dimming of the light in his eyes, the way he stopped humming when he worked at his drafting table. The final betrayal was swift and brutal. Alistair, having secretly leveraged the company's assets into a series of disastrous side ventures, had created a mountain of debt. He presented the doctored books to Robert, framing him as a negligent partner responsible for the financial chaos. The choice was stark: sign a non-disclosure agreement and a contract that ceded all his past, present, and future intellectual property to Blackwood Holdings for a token sum, or Alistair would ensure he was publicly crucified and buried in lawsuits he could never afford to fight. "He said he was protecting me from the fallout," Robert had told her mother one night, his voice a broken whisper Eleanor overheard from the hallway. "He said it was the only way to keep my name clean. He smiled while he did it, Helen. He smiled." The Blackwood Manor, Robert's masterpiece, the house he'd poured his soul into, became the symbol of their ruin. While the Blackwoods hosted lavish parties within its walls, the Vances were forced to sell their home, to downsize, to fade into obscurity. The legacy Alistair had spoken of was built, but it was built on the foundations of her father's broken dreams. After her parents were gone, Eleanor's grief was a vast, empty ocean. For a year, she drifted. Then, one day, clearing out the last of her father's possessions from a storage unit, she found it, a hidden compartment in his old drafting case. Inside were his private journals and a duplicate set of the manor's final blueprints, covered in his spidery, handwritten notes. These were not just architectural plans. They were a diary of the house's creation. He noted secret passages he'd designed as a playful whim, a hidden wine cellar behind a false wall in the library, a small, soundproofed study concealed behind a rotating bookshelf in the master suite. Features he'd planned to surprise Alistair with, gifts of friendship. Gifts that, in his haste to take possession, Alistair had likely never even discovered. But more importantly, the journals detailed Alistair's business dealings. His casual remarks about shell corporations, his boasts about hiding assets offshore. Her father hadn't understood the implications, writing them down as the confusing talk of a man obsessed with money. To Eleanor, holding the journals 2 decades later, they were a roadmap. That was the day the drifting stopped. The grief remained, but it now had a purpose. It became the fuel for a cold, patient fire. She enrolled in night classes, first in accounting, then in corporate law. She worked as a paralegal, a bookkeeper, a waitress, any job that allowed her to learn and to save. Every dollar she earned was a stone laid on the path to the Blackwood's door. Her breakthrough came when she tracked down Arthur Gable, the former chief financial officer of Blackwood Holdings. Gable was an old man now, living in a quiet retirement community, haunted by his complicity in Robert Vance's ruin. At first he refused to speak with her, but Eleanor was persistent. She didn't threaten him, she appealed to the ghost of his conscience. Alistair Blackwood didn't just destroy my father's career, she told him, sitting in his small, sun-drenched living room. He destroyed the man. And you stood by and held his coat. Over several meetings, Gable's resistance crumbled. He confessed that the guilt had eaten at him for years. He told her about Alistair's hubris, his tendency to over-leverage, to hide his biggest assets within convoluted legal structures to protect them from creditors. The crown jewel, Blackwood Manor itself, wasn't owned by Alistair personally. It was held by a shell corporation named Arbor Holdings, which in turn was owned by another and another. The deed was the primary asset, securing a massive, low-interest loan that Alistair used as his personal line of credit for risky stock market gambles. This was the weakness, this was the flaw in the fortress. With Gable's guidance, Eleanor began her assault. It was painstakingly slow. Using her meager inheritance and every cent she earned, she began to buy that debt. Not directly, but through intermediaries, through brokers, in tiny untraceable parcels on the secondary debt market. It was a high-wire act. If Alistair ever decided to pay down the principal or renegotiate the loan, she would be ruined. But Gable knew his old boss. Alistair was too arrogant, too convinced of his own invincibility. He only ever paid the interest, viewing the debt as a clever tool, not a potential threat. For 5 years, Eleanor lived like a pauper, pouring all her resources into this singular goal. She ate instant noodles so she could afford to buy another $1,000 piece of the Blackwood's world. She wore second-hand clothes so she could pay her legal retainers. While Julian Blackwood was buying sports cars and Cynthia was acquiring fine art, Eleanor Vance was quietly, patiently buying their home out from under them. The final piece fell into place last week. A disastrous bet on a biotech firm had cost Alistair a fortune. A margin call had forced him to liquidate other assets, and in the ensuing chaos he missed a crucial covenant payment on the Arbor Holdings loan. It was a technicality, a minor breach, but it was the opening she needed. Her lawyers, acting for the now majority debt holder, a shell corporation of her own creation named Vance Legacy LLC, exercised their legal right. They called in the entire loan, effective immediately. Alistair, through his lawyers, had laughed it off. He'd tried to bully them, to threaten them. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He assumed it was just another vulture fund. He tried to get a new loan to cover the old one, but his recent losses had made him toxic to lenders. The deadline for payment was noon yesterday. He had missed it. This morning, as Eleanor was ironing her waitress uniform, her lawyer had called. The transfer was complete. The deed to the property at 1000 Crestview Drive, known as Blackwood Manor, was now legally and irrevocably in the name of her corporation. She was the owner. The wine stain on her chest was no longer a mark of shame. It was a splash of victory. Cynthia Blackwood had christened the new lady of the manor without even knowing it. The grand ballroom was thinning out. The lesser satellites in the Blackwood social orbit had departed, leaving only the inner circle, family, close friends, and key business associates Alistair wanted to impress. They were gathered near the fireplace, sipping ancient cognac, the mood mellow and self-congratulatory. Alistair Blackwood stood with his back to the roaring fire, a portly Roman emperor surveying his domain. 50 years, he was saying, his voice resonating with false sentiment. Cynthia and I have built more than a family. We have built a legacy, a fortress, something that will stand for generations to come. He raised his glass. To the Blackwoods. To permanence. To permanence, the group murmured in reply. It was at that precise moment that Eleanor stepped through the grand archway into the ballroom. The sound of her heels on the marble floor was sharp and distinct, a deliberate counterpoint to the soft classical music still playing in the background. A few heads turned, their expressions morphing from mild curiosity to confusion. They recognized the waitress from the earlier unpleasantness. What was she doing back here? Then Cynthia saw her, her face, softened by cognac and adulation, instantly hardened into a familiar mask of aristocratic fury. "You," she spat, her voice a venomous hiss. "I told you to get out. How dare you show your face in my home again? Security!" Two burly men in black suits, who had been standing discreetly by the entrance, started forward, their expressions grim. Julian, lounging in an armchair, sat up, a cruel, eager light in his eyes. He seemed to relish the thought of seeing her physically thrown out. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply held up a hand, a gesture of such calm authority that the two guards actually paused, looking back at Alistair for confirmation. "That won't be necessary," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the suddenly silent room. She let her gaze sweep over the assembled guests before settling on Cynthia. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. You see, you're the one who is trespassing." A wave of incredulous laughter rippled through the group. Julian snorted into his drink. "Is she insane? Did the wine go to her head?" Alistair Blackwood finally turned his full attention to her. He peered at her as if she were a particularly resilient insect. "I don't know who you are, young lady, or what kind of pathetic game you're playing, but you have 2 seconds to leave before I have you charged." "My name," she said, taking a slow step forward, "is Eleanor Vance." She watched Alistair's face closely. For a flicker of a second, a shadow of recognition crossed his features. Vance. The name was a ghost from a past he had long since buried. He quickly masked it with a dismissive scowl. "I don't care if your name is the Queen of England," he blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Get out of my house." "That's the thing, Alistair," Eleanor said, her use of his first name a deliberate, shocking intimacy. "We need to stop calling it that. It's not your house. Not anymore." She walked past the stunned guards, her steps measured and confident. She stopped before the large mahogany table in the center of the room, placing her small leather clutch upon its polished surface. The remaining guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this was more than just the deluded ranting of a disgruntled employee. There was an unnerving power radiating from this woman, a stark contrast to the cowering girl who had knelt on the floor cleaning up broken glass just an hour before. "My father was Robert Vance," she continued, her voice never rising, yet it cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "Perhaps you remember him. The man whose genius you built your fortress on. The man whose name you erased from the letterhead. The man you destroyed." Alistair's face went from red to a pasty white. The ghost was no longer a flicker. It was standing before him, draped in a black dress and demanding a reckoning. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his bravado beginning to crack. "Robert and I parted ways amicably. Business is business." "You called the contract you forced him to sign business," Eleanor replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every person in the room strained to hear. "You called stealing his life's work business. You left him with nothing. You left me with nothing." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the opulent silence. "But he did leave me one thing. He left me his memory, and a very, very good blueprint." She opened her clutch. The guests leaned in, expecting a weapon, perhaps. A letter. Something dramatic. What she produced was far more lethal, a single folded document. Cynthia let out a shrill, nervous laugh. "What is that?" "Your letter of resignation. It's a bit late for that, dear." Eleanor unfolded the paper with deliberate care. It was thick, creamy stock, covered in official stamps and signatures. "This," she announced, her eyes locked on Alistair's, "is the deed to 1000 Crestview Drive. And this," she pointed to the final signature line, a flourish of ink still looking fresh, "is the name of the new owner, Vance Legacy LLC, my company." A stunned, absolute silence fell over the room. The only sound was the crackle of the logs in the massive fireplace. Alistair Blackwood stared at the document in Eleanor's hand, his mouth slightly agape, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. That's impossible," he finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse croak. "That's absurd. It's a forgery." "Is it?" Eleanor's tone was dangerously soft. "Why don't you call your lawyer?" "Oh wait, you can't. My legal team has had him tied up in emergency injunctions since Friday. Or perhaps you could call your bank manager at Sterling Trust. I'm afraid he won't be much help either. He's the one who authorized the asset transfer this morning when Arbor Holdings, your shell company, officially defaulted on its loan obligations." She saw the flicker of comprehension in his eyes. Arbor Holdings, the margin call, the missed payment. To him, they had been disconnected annoyances, fires to be put out. He never imagined they were all part of a single, coordinated attack. "You're lying," Cynthia shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. She took a step towards Eleanor, her hand raised as if to snatch the paper. "This is our home. We have lived here for 30 years. "You have been squatting here for 30 years, Eleanor corrected her, her voice as cold and sharp as ice. "You lived here on borrowed time, funded by a stolen legacy. The bill has just come due." Julian, who had been watching the scene with a sort of detached amusement, finally seemed to grasp the severity of the situation. He scrambled out of his chair. "This is crazy. You're a waitress. You can't just buy a house like this." "You're right," Eleanor agreed, turning her chillingly calm gaze on him. "A waitress can't. But the sole heir to Robert Vance's estate, who has spent the last 10 years of her life liquidating every hidden asset he managed to squirrel away, and another 5 years using that capital to methodically purchase the debt you were all too arrogant to notice, was for sale. She can." She laid it all out for them, her voice a calm, damning monotone. She spoke of Gable, the repentant accountant. She spoke of the secondary debt markets. She spoke of the loan covenants Alistair had ignored. She didn't gloat, she simply stated the facts, each one a nail being hammered into the coffin of their life. The business associates who had been clustered around Alistair began to subtly edge away, their faces masks of shock and dawning realization. They were rats sensing a ship not just sinking, but already at the bottom of the ocean. Alistair stumbled backwards, collapsing into a high-backed chair. His face was ashen, his breathing ragged. He looked for the first time like an old, defeated man. The Roman emperor was gone, replaced by a frightened shell. "My collections. My art," he whispered, the words barely audible. "They are fixtures of the property, according to the security agreement you signed," Eleanor said without a shred of pity. "Collateral, just like the Aubusson rug your wife so carelessly stained earlier this evening. I suppose I should thank her. I was wondering how to get that red wine stain out. Now I can just replace the whole thing." Cynthia let out a strangled sob. The cruelty of the remark, mirroring her own words back at her, was devastating. This wasn't about money or property anymore. This was a systematic dismantling of her entire world, her identity, her pride. Eleanor looked around the magnificent room, at the soaring ceilings and priceless tapestries. Her father's vision, her father's soul. It was finally being cleansed of the disease that had infested it for 3 decades. "I believe you have some personal effects upstairs," she said, her voice regaining its formal, commanding tone. "Clothes, jewelry, family photographs. I will be generous. I am giving you 1 hour to pack 1 suitcase each. After that, my security team, not yours, will escort you from the premises." "Security team?" Julian scoffed, a last flicker of defiance in his voice. "What security team?" As if on cue, the main doors of the ballroom swung open. 2 men entered, followed by several more. They were not the party security. These men were taller, broader, and wore professional dark uniforms with a discreet logo on the sleeve. Vance security. They were calm, professional, and their eyes surveyed the room with an unnerving efficiency. The Blackwoods and their remaining guests were trapped. The fortress had fallen, and the gates were now held by the enemy. Eleanor turned her back on the crumbling family and faced the fireplace, the same spot where Alistair had made his pompous speech about permanence just minutes earlier. She reached into her clutch again and retrieved the cigar and the silver lighter. With practiced hands, she clipped the end of the cigar. The remaining guests watched, mesmerized by the sheer audacity of the gesture. She held the deed, the certified copy, in her hand. It was the weapon that had won the war, the culmination of a lifetime of pain and planning. But it was also just paper. The real victory was here, in this room, in the terrified eyes of the people who had wronged her. She flicked the lighter, but didn't bring it to the cigar. Instead, she touched the small, bright flame to the corner of the deed. The corner of the thick paper blackened, curled, and then caught, blossoming into a small, bright orange flame. The room held its collective breath. The legal document, the symbol of her ultimate victory, was burning in her hand. It was an act of such supreme theatrical confidence that it transcended arrogance and became something akin to art. Eleanor watched the flame consume the signatures and legal jargon, her expression unreadable. She was not destroying her claim, she was consecrating it. This was a funeral pyre for her father's pain, for her mother's grief, for her own long, lonely years of sacrifice. It was an offering to the ghosts of the past, a signal that their restless spirits could finally be at peace. When the flame was just inches from her fingertips, she calmly lifted the burning document to the tip of the cigar. The dry tobacco leaves caught instantly, glowing a fiery red. She took a long, slow draw, inhaling the rich, smoky taste of her triumph. The smoke was acrid and sweet, the smell of justice. She let the last remnant of the burning paper, now a fragile black ash, fall onto the marble hearthstone. It disintegrated on impact, a fleeting testament to the impermanence of the Blackwood Empire. Then she turned. She exhaled a plume of pale grey smoke, which swirled in the air between her and the shattered family. Her eyes, magnified by the firelight, were dark and resolute. She looked directly at Cynthia, whose face was a mess of running mascara and disbelief. "You spilled wine on me in my house," Eleanor said, her voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The words were simple, a plain statement of fact, yet they carried the weight of an epic saga. They were the beginning and the end of the story, the insult and the final verdict. She then shifted her gaze to Alistair, who looked shrunken and pathetic in his grand chair, and finally to Julian, who stood frozen, his youthful arrogance finally, completely extinguished, replaced by a raw, uncomprehending fear. She took another deliberate puff from the cigar, holding it with an easy elegance, as if she had been born to this manner, to this moment. The last vestiges of the timid waitress were gone, burned away with the corner of the deed. In her place stood the true heir of Robert Vance, a woman forged in betrayal and tempered by a singular, unyielding purpose. "It's mine now," she stated, not as a boast, but as an undeniable, elemental truth. The smoke curled from her lips as she spoke the final devastating words. "Get out." For a long moment, the two words hung in the sepulchral silence of the room, more final than a judge's gavel. The Blackwoods stared, their faces a triptych of crumbling disbelief. It was Cynthia who broke first, her carefully constructed facade of icy composure shattered into 1,000 pieces. "No!" The word was a raw, ragged shriek that tore through the quiet. "You can't do this. We are the Blackwoods. This is our legacy. Our friends are here." She gestured wildly at the remaining guests, who now looked anywhere but at her, their gazes fixed on their shoes, the tapestries, the crystal chandeliers, anything to avoid the spectacle of this social immolation. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate step towards her. The cigar smoke trailed behind her like a phantom's cloak. "Your friends?" she asked, her voice deceptively gentle. "Look at them, Cynthia. These aren't friends. They are associates. They orbited your power, your money. You never offered them friendship, only proximity to your status. And now that the sun has set, the satellites are drifting away." As if to prove her point, one of the men, a portly real estate developer, cleared his throat and began to shuffle towards the door, his wife in tow. We should be going, he mumbled, not looking at anyone. The head of Vance Security simply nodded, and one of his men opened the door for them. It was the beginning of an exodus. Julian, his face purple with impotent fury, lunged forward. You bitch, I'll ruin you. I'll sue you into the ground. You'll be begging on the streets when I'm through with you. He was stopped not by Eleanor, but by the two security men who moved with a silent, fluid precision, flanking him before he could take a third step. They didn't touch him, but their presence was a wall of muscle and intent. Eleanor didn't even seem startled. She simply raised an eyebrow, her gaze on Julian so cold it could have frozen his blood. Sue me, she repeated, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in her eyes. With what money, Julian? The Blackwood Holdings accounts were frozen by court order at 4 p.m. this afternoon, pending a full audit for 2 decades of financial fraud. Your personal trust fund, which was illegally seeded with diverted company assets, was seized at 4:05. The keys to your Italian sports car now belong to one of my lawyers. You are, for all intents and purposes, penniless. Julian's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The colour drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, mottled grey. He looked from Eleanor to the impassive faces of the security team, the full crushing weight of his new reality crashing down upon him. He was nothing. The power he had wielded his entire life was an illusion, and the puppeteer had just cut his strings. Finally, Alistair stirred in his chair. He pushed himself up, his movements slow and pained, like a man twice his age. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, were now clouded with a desperate, pleading terror. He looked past Eleanor, his gaze searching the room until it landed on a silver-haired man standing quietly by the bar, a man who had watched the entire proceeding with an unreadable expression. Marcus, Alistair rasped, his voice cracking. Marcus Thorne, for God's sake, man, you're the head of private equity at Sterling Trust. You know this is impossible. It's a hostile, illegal seizure. Tell her, call your people, we can fix this. Every eye in the room turned to Marcus Thorne. He was the last bastion of the Blackwood's power, a tangible link to the financial world that had sustained them. He was their peer, their ally. Marcus took a deliberate sip of his scotch. He placed the glass carefully on the bar, the small click echoing in the cavernous silence. He then turned, his movements unhurried, and faced Alistair. But he did not speak to him. Instead, he looked directly at Eleanor, and for the first time, his face broke into a small, respectful smile. He gave her a slight bow of his head. My congratulations on a successful acquisition, Ms. Vance, Marcus Thorne said, his voice smooth and clear. The final wire transfers were confirmed at 11:03 a.m. Everything proceeded exactly as you instructed. It was the final killing blow, the twist of the knife that found the heart. Alistair let out a sound, a choked, guttural gasp of air, and staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. Marcus Thorne wasn't his ally, he was hers. The ultimate insider, the man Alistair had been courting for months, had been her agent all along. You, Alistair whispered, pointing a trembling finger at Thorne, you helped her. Mr. Gable, your former CFO, is a very old friend of my father's, Marcus replied, his tone now glacial. He came to me 5 years ago with a story of a great injustice and a very determined young woman. I found the story compelling, and Ms. Vance's financial strategy was, I must say, flawless. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just an enemy at the gate, the enemy had been inside the fortress all along, dining at their table, drinking their wine, and patiently waiting for the signal to open the doors from within. Eleanor walked over to the grand fireplace, turning her back on the wreckage of the family. She looked up at the portrait that hung above the mantelpiece, a massive, opulent painting of Alistair and Cynthia in their prime, smiling their smug, proprietary smiles. My father had a saying, she said, her voice soft and conversational, yet it carried the weight of a final judgment. He said that a house has a soul, that it remembers. This house remembers the man who dreamed it into being. And tonight, it is finally breathing again. She turned back to them one last time. Cynthia was weeping openly, her sobs ugly and raw. Julian stood catatonic between the two guards. And Alistair? Alistair was a hollowed-out ruin of a man, his empire turned to ash around him. "Your hour starts now," Eleanor said. The head of her security team nodded, then spoke into his wrist. "Team B, proceed upstairs. 1 suitcase each. Escort them out the service entrance." There was no more argument, no more fight. There was nothing left. The Vance security team moved with quiet professionalism, guiding the 3 broken figures towards the grand staircase, the one her father had said was the breathing heart of the house. They began their slow, final ascent, not as masters, but as prisoners on their way to exile. The last of the guests scurried out, avoiding Eleanor's gaze as if she were Medusa. Soon, only she and Marcus Thorne remained in the vast, silent ballroom. The air, once thick with perfume and arrogance, now smelled only of wood smoke, old stone, and the faint, triumphant scent of her cigar. She walked to the tall French doors and pushed them open, stepping out onto the stone terrace. The cool night air was a balm. Below her, the manicured gardens, her father's gardens, stretched out in the moonlight. The house was finally quiet. The ghosts were at peace. The debt was paid in full. She took one last draw from the cigar, its glowing tip a small star of defiance in the darkness, and then, with a flick of her wrist, she sent it arcing into the night, a dying ember of a fire that had burned for 20 years.